Coming up, I have a very special guest with me today, Peter Spencer, ex-Sky News political correspondent for many years and now of GB News, but don't hold that against him. If you enjoy watching the Truth to Power channel, I'd really appreciate it if you'd help me out by hitting the like button and especially by sharing a link to this video on your social media platforms. Peter, absolute pleasure to welcome you to Truth to Power. Very nice
Joy
to see
to
you.
be here, my dear chap. Absolute joy.
Now, you've been around, I don't want to be rude about this or ingracious, but you've been around in the political game for quite a few years now. Have you ever in your life ever seen anything quite as incredible as the Truss Kwarteng budget?
The answer to that is I have not. The whole Truss Kwarteng debacle, I've never seen anything like at all. And the extraordinary thing is that, I have actually been kicking around Westminster for half a century.
Half a century.
And so I've seen some pretty bloody bloodletting over the years.
Right.
But something like this, well, of course not. I mean, it's not possible to have seen anything like this in a government that lasts 10 minutes, and wrecks the economy overnight. I mean, yeah, that's quite an achievement.
Absolutely.
But I mean, and looking at it was just extraordinary, just the sheer amateurishness.
Yes.
Of that budget, when they didn't run it past the Office of Budget Responsibility, they didn't do any of the normal checks and balances, they didn't
Sack the most senior civil servant in the Treasury because he wasn't saying what they wanted him to say.
Sure. But it was just, but as I say, it comes back, as I say, as sheer amateurism.
Yes.
And also, I mean, the naivety on the part of Liz Truss, that of course during the leadership campaign she would very happily tell the Tory members, this sort of half of 1% of the population, what they wanted to hear, because they're generally speaking relatively advanced in years and they're generally relatively well heeled. So you say, listen guys, we're going to cut your taxes, they're going to love that. But it doesn't work.
Right.
In the broader economy.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I've spoken a lot on this channel about the emphasis and the influence of the Tufton Street think tanks. I mean, Kwarteng and Truss were very much children of the sort of libertarian wing, the sort of right-wing Adam Smith type economics. Yeah. Where does that leave Tufton Street? Do you think it's harmed them, having had their sort of grand theories actually put into practice and seen what a cluster they made of things? Where do you think it leaves them?
Well, it doesn't do them any great favours, but then generally speaking, between what organisations like that have to say for themselves and what emerges in the form of government policy, there are a fair few filters along the way. And I'm coming back to the point you made about the senior bloke in the Treasury getting their sack. I mean, that's one of the many filters. So I think I do say that the culpability lies firmly in the lap of Truss and Kwarteng rather than the people that advise them, because they always get advice from a million different
Of course.
sources.
So what do you think of the Jeremy Hunt, shall we say, autumn statement this week? Which is the budget, wasn't it, really?
Well, it's a mini maxi. I mean,
Yeah.
big time. Well, I mean, I think it was cleverly put together. I mean, I make the point that in 1947, the then Chancellor, Hugh Dalton, who was on his way into the chamber, and he saw a mate of his who worked for an evening paper, Carwell, and he said, he just over his shoulder, he couldn't resist it, he said, oh yeah, a couple of, a penny on fags, a penny on booze, and on the GGs, that's it. Confident that he'd be then walk into the chamber and deliver his speech a few minutes later, in which case, of course, it takes a few hours to actually get the paper onto the streets, but there was some ridiculous delay, and he must have been sat there in the chamber thinking,
oh my God.
I don't believe this. And he had to resign.
Right, so the newspaper came out before he'd actually told
Precisely.
Which was, traditionally, I mean, even as a mere youngster myself, I know this.
Me too, dear.
It's meant to be, it's like, it's an insult to the Parliament, really. They're meant to hear it first. It's parliamentary prerogative that they meant to hear these releases first.
They are meant to, and generally, well, you do get cock-ups along the way, but generally speaking, it's sort of respected. But in the case of this mini-maxi budget autumn statement, call it what you will, the decision was taken, and a wise decision, that they were going to trail the whole thing in advance, so that you wouldn't get a situation that Kwarteng and Truss found themselves in, when the markets say, I'll have this, and then tank the economy.
Yeah.
And I mean, the great story of the budget is the non-story.
Yes.
Because the market just went, well. which is great.
Yeah.
So they didn't make things any worse.
They didn't spook the horses this time. We're meant to be living in this parliamentary democracy. And to me, it feels like we're in the control of the markets. Our politicians are doing what the markets dictate.
It's interesting you
Powerful.
mentioned that in one of Hilary Mantle's books, when Thomas Cromwell, and he said to somebody who was supposed to be running the government, and said, look, you do it my way, or I destroy you, me and my banking friends. Nothing much has changed.
Do you think it would be any different with a Labour government?
No.
No.
The backdrop is the same. The technology is just and it's the same. The spirits in the twangy braces. I mean, they're the same people.
So you think the next Labour government are also going to have a very firm view on the market to concentrate on market reactions?
Certainly, because I can't see the economy settling down onto a nice even keel in the next couple of years. I mean, but the only thing I can see, the big change that has been detectable, is that Sir Keir Starmer tended to look, with no disrespect to the man, as if he'd just swallowed a wasp.
Yeah.
But thanks to the debacle that he's witnessed and the opinion polls reflecting the fact that the Tories have cocked up spectacularly, he's actually looking more at ease in his own body, and he's sounding more self-assured.
He is sounding increasingly Tory.
Yeah. But I mean, you should get that. I mean, how much of a fag paper was there really between Tony Blair and John Major?
Well, that's true. That's true.
Yeah. And the point is made that it's senior pollsters have made the point, and so have a number of Tory MPs. I'm not wishing to be quoted, but saying, look, this budget felt like a Labour budget.
I certainly take your point, Peter. I mean, if you look back to a few years back when you had Jeremy Corbyn against Boris Johnson, as you say, the cigarette paper between, if we take now Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, it's just come back together. Which I think, it's leaving a lot of us Remainers, of which Peter is one, I should add. It leaves us Remainers.
I'm supposed to admit that I'm mainstream.
That's it. But it leaves us a bit disenfranchised because, the two major political parties in the UK, and no offence to my Scottish friends, obviously you have the SNP option who are very pro-EU, but for us
likewise,
poor English...
Northern Ireland too.
Yeah, likewise Northern Ireland. But I mean, as a Remainer, as somebody that wishes to rejoin the EU in due course, where should our vote go?
Well, we await developments on the Labour side because, I mean, they've taken the decision. I mean, you remember that Keir Starmer was the Labour Party's voice of remaining.
Yes.
And then he thought, OK, well, we lost. And so the decision has been taken, look, let's not sound like a Remoaner, so it's close. But I mean, the fascinating thing with all that is that, I think it was Goebbels, but I may be wrong, said, tell a lie enough times and they believe it. Yeah. This is the settled will of the people. They want to leave. But, but it was within, the majority for leaving was within the bounds of statistical error.
Yes.
And subsequent polls have shown sufficient buyer's remorse to suggest that if you had another one tomorrow, it'd go the other way. I think this is something that Starmer and his chums are going to address. But it's also interesting to note that although Rishi Sunak actually voted to leave, there's leaving and leaving, and he has been it's been Hunt, but nonetheless he's doing it clearly with the imprimatur of the Prime Minister, saying that we need to address the trade barriers between the United Kingdom and the European Union, and so another factor in all this is that because of the war in Ukraine. And there has been a great deal of international dialogue, of course, and including between us and the European Union's awareness that actually they aren't really outsworn enemy after all. They might have got that bit a bit wrong. They aren't really going to send over an armada or something. We have a dialogue. Yes, and also it's worth remembering that Sunak, at Winchester, posh school, the motto was manners maketh man. He's actually quite good at talking sensibly. Because it's not just Brexit, it's the terms of the Brexit. If we'd stayed in the single market, then most of these problems would just not have happened.
Yeah. No. But remember, every Brexit voter knew what they were voting for. Let's not forget that.
350 million extra for the
NHS.
How do they get away with that? I say, well, people should be told. You think, well, look, they were getting propaganda, and the Brexiteers were better at it. But it is the elephant in the room when it comes to the economy, and there is a burgeoning awareness of that fact.
You're right.
And so I think it will come back onto the agenda. That doesn't mean that we're suddenly going to go back in, but just adjust the terms a bit so
Yeah.
effectively on the single market. And that also means that the problem of Northern Ireland floats away.
Yes.
They just didn't think that through. In fact, I don't think they thought about it at all.
No, they just ignored it.
Yeah.
Just picking up on something you said, Peter, it's quite interesting. You said,
I said something interesting.
There's this fag paper between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer in terms of the political stance these days, or certainly the gap is closing.
Yeah.
But as you say, it's almost like Jeremy Hunt was sort of announcing that these non-tariff trade barriers between us and the EU would diminish over the next few years. Yeah. And I think, actually, as sort of somebody that thinks of myself as a natural Labour voter, although I'm not a member of the party at the moment, but you wonder if there could be a scenario where Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt become more pro-EU than Starmer is. And there's he, as the opposition, who's actually seems to be the one that's being left behind in his sort of make Brexit work sort of mantra. Do you think there's a danger of that?
It's amazing how the narrative can shift sort of almost subliminally, but I think you will see that change, and Starmer, well, for God's sake, I mean, I can imagine his frustration, because he's the lawyer that lost that case, wasn't he?
Right.
But I'm sure he'd be very, very happy indeed to revisit it.
Right. So you think he's going to wait till after the election and then things will change in his
Well,
approach,
I suspect that if there is more serious talk about addressing the trade barriers and easing us in the direction of the single market, then I'm sure he'll be very happy to go along with that.
Yeah. I mean, I hold out this hope, Peter, that, whatever you think of Jeremy Corbyn, and there will be different opinions out there, I have to say I loved his policies. I just didn't think he was the right choice as leader any more than I think Keir Starmer was the right choice for leader. What Keir Starmer did is he got voted as the leader of the Labour Party but promised to uphold the principles of the Labour Party manifesto that was constructed by Jeremy Corbyn, and as soon as he got the leadership he sort of backtracked on that, and one by one those manifesto principles are gone. Perhaps he's going to do the same thing with with the Brexit stance, do you think?
Oh, I think it's perfectly possible. And, there is a slight parallel to be drawn between Jeremy Corbyn and Liz Truss, in that they're both, in their diametrically opposed ways, kind of idealists.
Right.
And, in the case of Jeremy, I was very friendly with him when he was a backbencher, and he used to arrive at Westminster on his bike, and he used to make the joke to me. He said, I do charge the mileage on this bicycle. It's about sixpence a mile or something like that, and because he was that much of an outsider. And then when they thought, well, put him on the ballot, just sort of to be nice and just to give the impression of balance, all of a sudden he's the leader of the party.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit like Truss, really, that the MPs wanted Sunak, not her.
Yeah.
And but then she made that sort of diabolical pitch to them and all that stuff. But the fact is that she was not ready to be Prime Minister any more than Jeremy.
Right.
And they're both out of their depth.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I say, Jeremy Corbyn was my MP for several years. I lived in N4 in London, Finsbury Park. Jeremy Corbyn as an MP, I mean, we all loved him as an MP. As a leader, he's no Bernie Sanders. You knew Jeremy quite well when you were working. Were you working with Sky at the time?
Yeah. Well, I sort of knew everybody, and they all went out of their way to be nice to us because we had that platform. And then if they thought we were pretty schmucky, really, later on they would make that clear as well.
Peter, your experience as a political correspondent with Sky Television and latterly of GB News has put you in a position where you've been inside that Westminster bubble for many years, and you're a novelist. Can we just give a plug to your second book? Trudy's Tricks. Peter, do you want to tell us a little bit about this book?
I'd be delighted, yes. I mean, they always say with novelists, talk about what you know, and of course I know Westminster. And also I happen to be a parent and a grandparent, and so what we have here is a political satire stroke thriller, but essentially it's a comic novel, but it's seen through the eyes of a little girl. Her dad is a former Labour Prime Minister. He's still a very active campaigner. The book's very topical in lots of ways because it concerns the HS2 project, and it concerns a government which is strapped for cash, and but he wants to buy Chinese trains. The Chinese are not flavour of the month, as we know. Trudy's dad is very, very opposed to this idea because, look, the security angle. The American president, no resemblance to any person living or dead, of course, but his name is Mugwump. Trump. He's so concerned about the thought of the Brits buying the Chinese trains that he's actually prepared to go so far as to nuke Westminster. Trudy's dad gets caught in the crossfire, basically.
Right,
and
okay.
Trudy, who actually the action is, gets kidnapped first by the Americans, then by the Chinese. She manages to worm or charm her way out of the situations. It's a bit of a feminist tract, I have to say, because the women are all cleverer than the boys.
I've known Peter for many years. He's a dear friend of mine. I've only just found out today that he has actually been a political commentator on GB News for the last few weeks or so. This has been news to me. So, Peter, tell me a little bit about that.
I mean, I'm quite charmed by it. I went to their studios in Paddington to sort of meet the folk, and it felt like a family reunion because half the presenters are ex-Sky.
Right.
Yeah. And the theory was I was just going to drop by and sort of say hello, basically. And 10 minutes later, I was actually on air, which is it's got that sort of that Trudy style, childlike energy about it. Say, just do it, which is fun.
I think of GB News as being sort of predominantly, well, I mean, it was marketed as a predominantly right-wing sort of view, but that's not necessarily the case, is it?
No, it's not. It's all over the place, which is lovely.
Obviously, at the moment, the Labour Party have got a huge lead in the polls. The bounce with the Rishi Sunak appointment as Prime Minister has been very tiny. In fact, Labour have only lost a couple of percentage points, and that's mainly gone to the Reform Party.
Yes.
But we're still 2 years out, potentially, from the next election. How do you see that panning out? Do you think it's a shoo-in for Labour, or can things still go badly wrong for them?
A week in politics is a long time. Currently,
Yes.
about 10 minutes is a long time in politics.
Sure.
A great deal. And also, in the Twitter age, it's everything is so impulsive and so immediate, and it's like little children, something happens and then 2 minutes later it's completely forgotten.
Yeah.
And so...
so true.
But I think in large measure the huge poll boost for the Labour Party is not pro-Labour but just anti-Tory, because they've been so sort of rubbish, really. Yeah. That said, I mean, the point has been made by senior pollsters is that if the blame for the austerity that we're all having to endure, if the blame for that lands in the Tories' lap, then it is a shoo-in for Labour.
Right. Game over.
Yeah. And Starmer very clearly is looking a bit more chirpy and cheery and a little bit more appealing. He had this awful thing that he was boring, and he has to overcome that. That said, the Tories to some extent shot that fox pipe, because they've said, look, we've had this tumultuous period with Truss and Kwarteng. Let's be boring. Boring is safe is boring, but boring is safe.
Just one last plug for Trudy's Tricks.
Yeah, I'll just say it's actually very funny.
Oh, it's very funny. It's droll.
Because the thing is that I read it because I've got such a bad memory when I'd written it. And then it was because the production takes a year or so, all that stuff. So I'd forgotten what was in it, really. And I was reading it thinking...
I mean, I haven't had a chance to read Trudy's Tricks yet. I did read the first instalment of the trilogy. It's very funny, first of all. Greatly drawn characters, particularly the cat. But it reminded me of sort of like a Tom Sharp type riff.
Yes.
Taken to another level, really.
This is
that
much,
unfair?
No, it's quite fair. This is much gentler.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for joining me today. It's probably the first and last time we'll ever have a GB News political correspondent on the Truth to Power channel, but never say never, and hopefully we can have you back at some point.